In part 1 of this series, I gave 3 reasons why Biafra wants to separate from the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I briefly made argument for Nigeria's flawed foundation, the vicious ethnic hatred, rise of jihadism and the senseless massacres of Christians, especially Igbos in the north. As I begin the second and concluding part, it is pertinent to alarm that Sharia legislation has passed second reading in the Federal House of Representatives. This is a bill designed to make criminal aspects of Sharia court a state and federal law. That means Sharia courts will be set up in all the states of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. What does this law portend for Nigeria, especially for Christians in Nigeria? I'll leave that question for our constitutional lawyers and legal scholars to answer it. However, for me, Sharia law and Sharia court are in direct violation of the nation's constitutional democracy. Nigeria is reputed to be a secular, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. Moreover, we do not have Christian courts in Nigeria. Why in the world would the second branch of our government pass a law that violates and contradicts the Constitution of Nigeria? Is Nigeria an Islamic State or a secular nation? The most annoying thing about all this is that no single legislator, those elected to enact laws according to the Constitution of the Federation, challenge the bill, which if instituted as federal law, will ultimately destroy Nigeria. In addition to the Sharia bill, the National Assembly is also quietly debating the so-called grazing bill, which is designed to allow Fulani herdsmen to rear their cows and cattle anywhere in the Federation. Recently, we have seen cows and cattle being paraded all over the capital city of Abuja, and recently, cows were seen in front of the central bank and near the international airport Abuja. As I write, the Fulani herdsmen, whom the Sultan of Sokoto and all the northern governors defended as foreigners, are rampaging farmlands across many towns and villages in Nigeria, raping young girls, women, including married women, and wasting innocent lives. I often wonder if we are truly human beings or probably subhumans as many white supremacists describe us. And when I read and see how Buhari APC government is going about governance in Nigeria, how he doesn't give a damn about these issues and how the Nigerian masses are not reacting to these barbaric and senseless killings, I can only conclude that we have become a coward citizenry and subdued people, or simply we are allowing President Muhammadu Buhari to govern us with impunity without exercising our rights to free speech as democratic citizens. Nigeria is not working under President Buhari. It is so sad and shameful that we are being ruled like a banana republic. What a shame and a sad situation. Let's leave the issue of Nigeria not working for next time and focus on the remaining 4 reasons among many other factors that are fueling Biafra agitation for self-determination and separation from Nigeria. 4. Cultic rulers and corrupt politicians. For the last 55 years, governance in Nigeria has been hijacked by a group of selfish, greedy, egoistic, visionless, malicious, mischievous and treacherous rulers. Since Nigeria gained independence in October 1, 1960, the nation has not had honorable men and women to pilot the affairs of the nation but cultic and corrupt individuals. Nigeria has not really enjoyed any genuine political peace and national prosperity despite her enormous natural resources and abundant human capital that God endowed her with. Instead, the country has been ruled and governed by military dictators and political opportunists that have denied the citizens basic needs of livelihood, such as food, housing, health, good road, drinkable water, electricity, and of course things like order, peace, and security, which are the primary duties and functions of government. For 56 years since independence, Nigeria has had a military dictatorship, political hypocrisy, idolatrous religious system, and extravagantly indulgent corrupt judicial system that oppressed the poor, the less privileged and minority members of the Federation. In a nutshell, Nigeria's rulers have failed to fulfill their basic obligations to the nation and its people. In his famous and widely quoted treatise on Nigeria, The Trouble with Nigeria, the eminent scholar and world-renowned poet, late Professor Chinua Achebe writes, "The trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership." In his classic book, The Open Sore of a Continent, a personal narrative of the Nigerian crisis. The literary icon, an international acclaimed playwright, essayist and Nobel Peace Prize winner, novelist Wole Soyinka brilliantly and succinctly writes about the corruption, human rights abuses, bad leadership and political bondage in which Nigeria and most of Africa was subjected to since her independence. And so, what we have had in Nigeria and continues to have today, is a superficial, cryptic, unqualified and incompetent group of rulers, a political cult and corrupt elites that have crippled the nation and destroyed the enormous human potential that exists in Nigeria. Today, those that make up the entity called Nigeria hate each other with satanic passion and can't work together. Today, Nigeria is governed by a group of myopic rulers that are only after their own personal profit, power, and influence. They are greedy, incompetent and hungry wolves who abuse power for their personal gain and pleasure. They enjoy lavish lifestyles, showing off their ill-gotten wealth, enjoying cheap sex while millions of citizens go hungry. They are driven by greed, corruption, jealousy and hatred of other members of the federation. These political elites extort, levy heavy taxes on poor citizens, take bribery and loot the state treasury. They lie, compromise, harass, threaten and even resort to murder in order to attain and solidify their temporal influence, superficial charm and evil power. It was during the era of the generals like Ibrahim Babangida and Sani Abacha as well as the presidency of Shishagari and that of Olusegun Obasanjo, that corruption was staunchly enthroned and celebrated in Nigeria. The country witnessed monumental cases of corruption and bribery for tax evasion, embezzlement, looting of state and national treasury by the very people entrusted with management of public treasury and nation's wealth. General Babangida, in particular, destroyed the Nigerian economy and basically rubbished the nation's societal values by elevating greed, bribery, and corruption as well as enthroning most of the crooks, cronies and the pathetic individuals who still rule over the affairs of the nation today. Since the return to democratic presidential system of government in 1999, we have seen an unprecedented scandal for bribe, tax evasion, stealing, embezzlement, fraudulent contracts looting and money laundering by the very people entrusted with power and management of public treasury. Just to name a few, Siemens and Wilbur's bribery scandals for contracts, Halliburton tax bribery, Chevron, Texaco, Royal Dutch and Bakehues bribe for tax evasion, looting and money laundering by almost most of the governors that served during Obasanjo's first and second terms in office. Billions of naira were spent by an act that regaled PDP the most fraudulent election in the history of Nigeria in 2003 and 2007, the National Identity Card Project fraud, and 300 billion of federal road construction without any good road network to show for it, PDF looting, privatization of federal establishments to friends and families, and billions of waste in the energy sector and the list goes on. In 2007, Nigerians learned that the past military rule has squandered nearly $400 billion in the last 40 years. That same week, the World Bank and other international organizations reported that Nigeria risks collapse and disintegration if the current looting, corruption, and criminality do not stop. This year 2016, a study by World Bank and IMF estimated that Nigerian politicians have earned nearly $700 billion since crude oil was discovered in Nigeria. The $700 billion that our military rulers and corrupt politicians have stolen, looted and embezzled in the last 50 years is 54 times more than the $12 billion Marshall Plan and European Recovery Economic Aid and Technical Assistance Program that was packaged by America as aid to rebuild 16 European countries and economies that were devastated after the end of Second World War II. Today, our leaders travel to those European countries for holidays and medical treatment as well as send their children there for studies. The wealth of the nation that the military rulers and politicians looted, laundered and squandered could have been utilized to rebuild the entire sub-Sahara African economies and create the same luxury they see today in Europe, America, Asia, and Dubai. Instead, our rulers prefer to steal, loot, and launder public funds into their private accounts and secret banks overseas, where those same finances were loaned to citizens of those countries to start businesses and carry out all kinds of infrastructural projects and human capital development. It is really sad that Nigerian leaders loot their nation's wealth and launder that same stolen wealth to the banks owned by Western rich nations, while their own countries and people wallow in pandemic poverty, chronic diseases, misery, and death. Today, the loots of General Abacha are not only located in secret banks in Switzerland and other foreign banks, but are being discovered hidden in juju houses in Nigeria, while poverty, disease, corruption and hopelessness buffet the people. What a travesty. What a curse. By the way, for President Buhari to properly own the legacy of truly curbing and exterminating corruption in Nigeria, even though his war against corruption has been selective, he must go back to the 80s, during the presidency of another weak and corrupt government of Shishagari through the brutal military dictatorship of Abacha, Buhari, IBB, and others. Until today, the Swiss banks are still repatriating millions stolen by the brutal dictator Abacha. President Buhari should also investigate Halliburton scandal, PDDF, NNPC, etc., during President Obasanjo's tenure and so forth. Nigerian rulers are evil, wicked and visionless. They are simply selfish and empty human beings. Biafrans do not want to be part of this criminal enterprise. 5. Witchcraft, Satanic and 419 churches. Today, the streets of cities, towns, and even villages in Nigeria, especially southern Nigeria, are littered with all kinds of churches, ministries and religious institutions, including satanic and witchcraft churches, of course. Some of these churches are led by false pastors and cultic priests promising healing, wealth, prosperity and happiness. In spite of the abundance of churches and such promises, vast majority of Nigerian citizens are among the poorest and sickest people in the world. Furthermore, one can see the abundant presence and practice of rituals, divination, astrology, sorcery, witchcraft, voodoo, magic, envy, greed, jealousy, hatred, idolatry, hypocrisy, ungodliness, wickedness, lust, immorality, adultery, while corruption remain rampant and alarming in the society. There is no sign of righteousness, love, peace and hope, but injustice, unrighteousness, hate, anger, resentment, bitterness, evil, wickedness, violence, killings, and hopelessness reign supreme in the country. There is no doubt that the Nigerian church and certain bishops in their fold are emulating and borrowing from the rich American church and her superstar pastors, bishops and televangelists like Pastor Benny Hinn, Bishop T.D. Jakes, Dr. Creflo Dollar, Bishop Eddie Long, Bishop Dale Bronner, Pastor Joel Austin, Pastor Joyce Meyer, Pastor Paula White, and Pastor Darlene Bishop, and many others. These imitators and imposters fail to understand that United States of America is a rich and capitalist country. The religious institution in America is a big business because of the capitalist nature of the country, and there are certain laws and privileges that support religious organizations to tap into the vast wealth and prosperity that exist in the nation without depending on the meager tithes and offerings of their members. And so today, prosperity and healing gospel pervade every nook and corner of Nigeria, including airspace, in spite of the fact that Nigeria is a poor country still. Moreover, there are no laws and regulations that support the church or seriously punish offenders. And so, false gospel message pervades the entire space. What we have nowadays is another gospel, a false gospel, and a religious syncretism. The gospel teaching that subtly implies and often overtly states that God wants you to be rich is a false gospel, writes Pastor Jim Bakker, a former prosperity preacher and proponent of God wants you rich theology, who dwindled his parishioners millions of dollars, and later, while serving term in prison, he diligently read and studied the scripture and God opened his understanding. That teaching, he says, does not line up with the tenets of the Holy Scriptures. It is another gospel, another Jesus, in fact, the gospel of Satan and message of hellfire, a prosperity-tinged Pentecostalism. The truth is that modern-day church is a designer church, a church that is totally misconstrued, misguided and misinformed, where spiritual witchcraft and biblical ignorance are in abundance, a church that is bewitched, a church that is preaching and teaching another gospel, another Jesus and a message of get rich and get healed theology, a perverted church where the so-called men of God are preaching eisegesis rather than proper exegesis, what tickles the ears of their parishioners rather than sound doctrine, a church where ill-trained pastors and bishops are using pragmatic psychological philosophies for attaining success and for solving spiritual issues rather than sound exposition of God's word, a church where con men are using the word of God against gullible Christians for lucre and for profit. The July 2007 edition of Christianity Today carried a survey conducted in 2006 by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. They found that 25% of Nigerian Christians are renewalists, that is Pentecostals and charismatic. The same survey noted that 33% of South Africans and 50% of Kenyans were also renewalists. Out of nearly 900 million Africans, which include Christians, Muslims, pagans, atheists and other religious persuasions, about 150 million Christians are now renewalists. Professor Paul Gifford of the University of London, England, in his 2004 book, New Christianity, Pentecostalism in a Globalizing African Economy writes, African Christians believe that success is determined by your faith. Professor Gifford notes that these renewalists have moved beyond traditional Pentecostal practices of speaking in tongues, prophesying, and healing to the belief that God will provide money, cars, houses, and even spouses, in response to the believer's faith, if not immediately, then soon. In the same 2006 survey by Pew Forum, 92% Nigerian Christians, 90% South African and 85% of Kenyan Christians agreed that wealth and material blessings are based on one's faith. What a tragedy and travesty. In fact, prosperity gospel is destroying Africa in an age of innovation and technological revolution. While nations are tapping into the next frontier of technology innovation and advancement, most Africans are looking up to their herbalists, pastors, and of course to heaven not for ideas but for God to rain millions on them. And this way of thinking pervades the African Christendom currently. They refuse to understand that man has stopped failing from heaven after the Israelites crossed River Jordan and settled in the land of Canaan. God commanded them to go to work and be innovative and productive. And so, what we have today in Africa as prosperity message is a muddled and schismatic gospel, Satan's gospel, a 419 scheme, a toxic and deadly scam designed for the sick, poor, lazy, gullible and biblical illiterate. Christianity is no longer an intellectual exercise in an age of prosperity gospel in Nigeria and most of Africa. Training to become a priest, pastor takes years of study and preparation. Sadly, the holy office is no longer sacred and intellectually stimulating because con men and women, who have no business with the holy calling, have desecrated it in order to dwindle and deceive the gullible and weak in the society. This kind of unbalanced gospel messages that are being promulgated by the so-called men of God and super pastors and preachers of our day is appalling and troublesome. Dr. Hank Hanegraaff, president of Christian Research Institute in California, and one of the finest and courageous Christian apologists of our time, in his book, Christianity in Crisis prophetically and passionately argued that modern-day Christianity is in crisis. He said that the church is undergoing a major transformation and that millions of Christians have embraced another gospel, another Jesus, the gospel of false promises of prosperity, wealth, healing, signs and wonders. He attributes the problem to lack of sound biblical training and seminary education. George Barna, the famous church consultant, researcher and writer, also supports Dr. Hanegraaff's postulations that the church is dying due to lack of sound Bible teachers and strong church leadership. In his best-selling book, Crisis in the Village, Dr. Robert M. Franklin, a theologian and public intellectual, wrote that the church has lost her moral mission, call and commitment. Christian faith has lost its value, respect and dignity. Today, there are an estimate of 3,000 religious organizations worldwide and about 3,000 satanic churches that literally worship Satan and all kinds of demonic worship. C.S. Lewis, The famous Oxford apologist for the faith, wrote, "We must return to Christianity in order to preserve the things we value. But we cannot return to Christianity at all unless the thing we value above all else is Christ. Otherwise, we are in effect asking to save our idols for us." Prosperity message is destructive and has negative effects. This blind spirituality is not only destructive, damaging, and deceptive but worse than slavery. It is bondage, abuse, deception, manipulation, godlessness and satanic capitalism. Most Nigerian Christians are only not enslaved spiritually, morally and financially but intellectually as well. It is economic, moral, and intellectual slavery. Millions of Nigerian Christians are now victims of satanic churches and their false prophets. The prosperity gospel is also destroying Nigerian society, family, homes, causing a combination of disappointment, hurts, discouragement, and anger toward God and sometimes causes people to turn away from God. What we have today is moral bankruptcy, biblical ignorance, a modern-day voodoo and satanic spiritualism. In a nutshell, a 419 in the church and a materialistic Christianity with enormous danger in it. Many of the clergymen parading themselves as men of God in the nation and claiming to hear from God or speak on his behalf are complete disappointment and disgrace to society. I wish they heard from God. If they did, Nigeria would not be in the sorry mess it is today. In fact, they are absolute failure to their calling and priesthood. Biafrans want to free themselves from these religious syncretism, witchcraft and adulterous religious organizations that exist in Nigeria today. 6. Failure of educational leadership, visionless universities and purposeless education. While many nations around the globe are prospering, educating their younger generation and motivating them to achieve great things in this 21st century world of scientific progress and technological advancement, Nigeria and most of Africa are trapped in a culture of corruption and bad leadership. Today, while technology innovation is linking people, especially young people and nations together through social media such as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., for great purposes, millions of young people in Nigeria are utilizing social media for fraud, immorality, crime, and violence. Despite the abundant natural resources and human potential that exist, Nigeria is listed among the poorest countries in the world. It has one of the lowest primary school completion rates in Africa. Also, Nigeria has one of the largest percentages of the 100 million children, mostly girls, who are out of school worldwide. Today, as the population has exploded and ballooned, many more children go to bed hungry while millions of families subsist on less than $1 a day. It is estimated that there are about 70 million people who are 30 years and under unemployed and without any form of employment in Nigeria today. That is a disaster for a nation. The culture of learning which was strong and admired by Nigerians has eroded due to weak educational leadership and corrupt government leaders. Since the return to democratic government in 1999, the portfolio of education has been held by corrupt and incompetent politicians. Moreover, most of the governors of the various states in Nigeria have been visionless and myopic. The university campuses have become centers for raping young girls, gang activities, deaths and cultic activities, in addition to constant strikes, poor lecturers and lack of funds. Everything nowadays is driven by money and even university admissions are now bought by rich people for their children. The schools are also dilapidated and teachers who cannot write simple correct sentences or speak eloquently are teaching Nigeria's future leaders. What a travesty! The evidence of lawlessness and purposeless education are so prevalent in today's Nigerian universities. That is why many young Nigerians are leaving the shores of Nigeria to elsewhere, even to the nearest neighboring countries like Ghana and South Africa to attend university. Those of them who are extremely lucky to go to Europe and United States are excelling in their studies and academics. So, why would any young person want to live in a nation that does not care for him or her, or treated as the future leaders of the country, receive proper training, developed and prepared to take over the affairs of the nation at some point? Why would they live in a nation without job after their university education and unemployment roaring at almost 80%? By the way, the Nigerian military is still searching for hundreds of phantom Chibok school girls who were supposedly taken away from their dormitories by Boko Haram for several years now. What a shame. While other nations around the globe are tapping into the 21st century high-technology world to educate their young generation, motivating them to achieve great things, creating young entrepreneurs, building massive wealth, and prospering as a nation, Nigeria continues to wallow in archaism, primitivism, backwardness, endemic corruption, visionless political leadership, ethnic and religious violence and genocidal war, and by so doing destroying every hope of nation building and promise of peace, unity, and prosperity. Biafrans want to sanitize the education sector, set up educational environment like the Western and Jewish educational system for viable innovation, creativity, economic development, progress, and prosperity. 7. Get rid of Igbo saboteurs, sellouts and puppet politicians in Biafra land. Although the Nigeria-Biafra civil war ended almost 46 years ago, with a declaration slogan, "No victor, no vanquished," yet former Eastern region is systemically marginalized, economically exploited and politically oppressed. Before the civil war, Ndigbo was a strong force to reckon with. They dominated every sector of the economy such as trade and retail. The former Eastern region was united and prosperous, a region that produces the major stake of Nigeria's revenue, not to mention the manpower, skills and resources that powered Nigeria's economy. The vibrant brain power and industrial cities of Aba, Onitsha, Niwai, and the corporate-like cities like Enugu, Port Harcourt, Calabar, etc., are now death traps, road network and mountains of rotten garbage lying all over the place. After the war, the former Eastern region was broken into two zones, Southeast and concocted South-South, with Southeast being the smallest among the 6 zones in the country. Today, the Southeast has the least number of states, local governments, and members of the House of Representatives, Senate and number of ministers and receives the least amount of revenue allocation despite the massive crude oil resources in 9 of the 11 states of SE/SS region. Also, the industrial economy of former Eastern region was destroyed after the Civil War and now our young people are reduced to be mere traders, drivers and beggars in Nigeria. The enterprising and entrepreneurial energy of Ndigbo has been destroyed by harsh and punitive policies aimed at marginalizing the region and its people. Furthermore, in the last 25 years and more, the former Eastern region comprising of Southeast and so-called South-South have been ruled mostly by political prostitutes and puppets imposed on Igboland. These are cultic and corrupt politicians who are sellouts and saboteurs for the House of Fulani Sokoto Caliphate and Yoruba oligarchy. With the exception of few leaders who are courageous and strong leaders like the former and outspoken Anambra State Governor Chief Chukwuemeka Ezeif, Ndigbo has not had honorable and courageous men and women to represent their interests in Nigeria. Today, many SE/SS politicians are money worshippers, egotistic, jealous and envious haters, who are willing to commit all kinds of atrocities against their own people in order to satisfy their masters and selfish lifestyles. Even in ministerial affairs, politicians from SE/SS region have mismanaged the enormous human potential and abundant natural resources in Biafra land because of greed, personal power, profit and pleasure. The political cultic club set up by House of Fulani Sokoto Caliphate and Yoruba oligarchy has failed Ndigbo. They are mostly sellouts and saboteurs, and their lack of compassion, inefficiency, incompetency, corruption, and visionless leadership have destroyed the political landscape and potential of Igboland. Because of their poor politics and greedy politicking, millions of Biafrans are wallowing in abject poverty, with dilapidated infrastructure, death-trap roads, lack of clean water, ill-equipped healthcare facilities, and poor education at levels, and massive unemployment. Bribery and corruption are endemic, poverty, hunger, pandemic disease, improvised infrastructure, and political conflicts are the norm in the Igboland today. As a result, the region is in a state of hopelessness due to imposed cultic politicians, weak and coward Igbo rulers. The SC politicians have woefully failed Ndigbo. Many, if not all of them, have mortgaged their consciousness, character and principle for personal lucre. Because of this, in the early 1990s, we witnessed many expulsors of separatism due to systemic marginalization, economic injustice and political oppression. Separatist leaders like Ralph Uwazurike of the Movement for the Actualization of the Sovereign State of Biafra, Ipob, and Asari Dokubo, a key figure in the Niger Delta struggle, and several others emerged. Former President Olusegun Obasanjo arrested and detained Alhaji Asari Dokubo of NDPVF, Dr. Fashion and Otunba Ganu Adams of OPC, and Chief Ralph Uwazurike of Ipob. Dr. Fashion and Otunba Adams regained their freedom soon after their arrests, but Asari Dokubo and Ralph Uwazurike were remanded in prison. Later, the late President Yar'Adua released Alhaji Asari Dokubo, leaving behind Chief Ralph Uwazurike of Ipob, who was an Igbo. He was released 2 years later. That was selective injustice. Today, we have Nnamdi Kanu, leader of the indigenous peoples of Biafra and director of Radio Biafra, who has been in Kuje prison for little over a year now despite 3 rulings of 3 courts that pronounced his release unconditionally. Biafrans want to be liberated from these selective injustices and capricious challenges facing them in Nigeria. Biafra wants to be freed from ethnic hatred and tribalism, injustice, bribery and political corruption, insecurity and militancy, religious ignorance, intolerance, and violence, lapses and paralysis in education sector, poverty and disease, moral and social decadence, and lack of patriotism, nationalism and national planning, among other severe challenges Nigeria is marred into. Biafrans want freedom and self-determination because of severe suffering and marginalization and numerous injustices against them by the House of Fulani Caliphate and Yoruba co-conspirators since the amalgamation of Nigeria in 1914. 100 years of suffering and servitude is enough. All Eastern region, states, organizations, groups, freedom fighters, etc. must unite now to liberate themselves and their land from Islamic State of Nigeria. All Easterners must work together and do whatever it takes to exit this failed state filled with hateful and murderous Boko Haram and Fulani herdsmen. All former Easterners must unite now and work together to make Biafra a reality, because there is no future and hope for us in Nigeria. We need courageous, visionary and skillful people in Biafra land to work together to emancipate the region from satanic subjugation, political oppression, systemic marginalization, foolishness, stupidity, mediocrity, incompetence, cowardice, jihadism, tyranny, poverty, disease, and hopelessness currently prevalent in Nigeria. We will become slaves and Islamized if we do not wake up from our slumber now to confront this ongoing satanic conspiracy and attack carefully orchestrated by the Northern oligarchy and their British friends to marginalize, destabilize Igbo and enslave our people. I am tired of living in bondage, slavery and servitude in my own country. It is time to live in freedom, liberty, justice and pursuit of happiness for all. It is time to live in prosperity. One Nigeria and unity cannot be by force. Even God himself did not tolerate unity of hate, abuse, dishonor, and death. If that was the case, God would still be sharing the heavenly abode today with the angel of light, Satan. God did not condone unity of circumcised with the uncircumcised people. Jesus Christ did not ask us to love and live with our neighbor. He only told us to love our neighbor. It does not mean we must live with a neighbor who wants to kill you. You don't have to live with a hateful neighbor. I firmly believe in the promise of Biafra. Biafra will set up a transparent, non-oppressive and innovative system of government that will create the environment where everyone within her sovereignty can flourish, be free, pursue liberty, justice and prosperity. Biafra will be a fantastic nation, perhaps the Israel or Japan of Africa. May God open our eyes, enlighten our minds and help us to forge the unity and foster the love necessary to confront this dastardly conspiracy and free ourselves from present enslavement and coming Islamization.